All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are cracking open what has to be one of the absolute most bizarre literary experiments out there. It's a source document called the Ouroboros Audit. And honestly, it reads like an incredibly cynical autopsy of a completely unhinged meta-novel. We're not just looking at a normal critique of a story today, we are looking at a brutal, frankly hilarious teardown of a 318,000-byte manuscript, performed by the very minds that created it.
The whole premise here is just absolutely wild. I mean, what actually happens when a human writer decides to team up with two different artificial intelligences, specifically Claude and Gemini, to write a dead serious, highly philosophical corporate thriller about economic despair? Well, according to the audit, they write the book and then they immediately turn around and ruthlessly roast their own creation. They essentially put their own work on trial to point out every single cliché, every logical gap, and every piece of horribly overwrought melodrama they managed to generate together.
Right off the bat, the audit calls out this hilarious juxtaposition in the opening scene where high-minded existential philosophy basically collides head-on with modern consumerism. You've got this finance pro named Thomas. He's standing on a bridge, ready to end it all, having these incredibly profound thoughts about the utter meaninglessness of capitalist existence. Yet, as he actually drops into the river, he absolutely refuses to let go of his Toomey briefcase. The authors mercilessly mock their own decision here. Thomas plummets to his death, sure, but he makes dead certain to clutch the biometric gym bag he bought with his first bonus. As they point out, that briefcase actually outlives him and probably just gets sold for $40 in New Jersey. Okay, so right before Thomas jumps, he hands this total stranger named Elias a super-sensitive encrypted drive containing world-shattering corporate secrets. The password? Sisyphus. But he explicitly adds capital S. The audit highlights the sheer absurdity of this moment. The entire plot of this massive anti-capitalist crusade depends on a stranger who, keep in mind, is currently in a state of deep emotional shock from just watching a guy jump off a bridge, correctly remembering case sensitivity. If Elias had tried a lowercase Sisyphus or maybe just added a number 1 at the end, the authors joke that the whole novel would have been about 4 pages long. Now, inside the novel, there's a very specific death toll that finally breaks Thomas's spirit. 8,000. It's presented as this beautifully tidy corporate memo detailing a plan to increase the fentanyl concentration in their products, simply noting an acceptable mortality increase of 8 to 12%. And Claude, one of the AI co-authors, points out that the true horror of the novel is actually the utter mundanity of this evil. The person casually signing off on the murder of 8,000 people holds the aggressively boring title of Director of Human Resources. But here's where it gets interesting, because this perfectly captures a massive creative crisis the authors ran into. They created this terrifying, realistic machine of corporate suffering with that HR memo. But then they panicked. They confess in the audit that they just didn't trust the spreadsheet to be scary enough for the reader. So they completely flinched. They gave their human CEO, Julian Volkov, literal demon eyes. Like the whites of his eyes are actually swallowed by expanding black pupils. They completely retreated from the very real terror of a corporate memo and opted for a cheap supernatural thrill instead. Which brings us to the villain himself, Julian Volkov. Gemini's perspective in the audit absolutely roasts this character as a masterclass in mid-2000s corporate edgelord angst. Volkov sits in freezing boardrooms, peels oranges with a silver knife, and speaks entirely in management aphorisms about collective hallucinations. Oh, and get this, he schedules corporate mergers for exactly midnight. As Gemini so perfectly points out, scheduling a compliance sign-off for the literal witching hour means the legal department must be billing an absolute fortune in overtime. And as we dive deeper into the novel's climax, the whole thing just derails into this sudden, jarring fantasy genre shift. The corporate thriller completely abandons reality for supernatural horror. Not only do Volkov's eyes turn black, but legal contracts literally start writhing in hieroglyphs, and the actual sky turns into a giant, unblinking eye of the market. Gemini notes this with pure snarky delight, pointing out how the narrative abruptly drops all financial reality and suddenly treats capitalism like some ancient cosmic demon consuming the skyline. Now, to make up for all this wild melodrama, the authors pull off what they call a philosophy speedrun. They confess in the audit that they were absolutely terrified of being dismissed as preachy, so they armored every single emotional beat in a heavy, intellectual 3-piece suit. The protagonist doesn't just feel dread, he feels Camus's dread, filtered through Jung, grounded in Marx, and seasoned with Buddha. As the authors themselves admit, they didn't write a thriller, they wrote a philosophy dissertation that occasionally features car chases. Which leads to, honestly, one of the most hilariously deadpan moments in the entire source material. The protagonist, Elias, wants to defeat this cosmic, metaphysical corporate entity that exists in the cloud. And how does he try to do it? By pulling out a very real, very physical gun that he bought in Newark. He raises the gun, and then suddenly realizes, you cannot assassinate an idea. The authors ruthlessly roast their own logic gap here. Elias bought a physical object with real money to shoot a physical man, but suddenly decides shooting him is philosophically insufficient because the man is a symbol. And speaking of that physical gun, Elias buys it from, quote, a man with no nose. Why does the man have no nose? Well, the authors have absolutely no idea. The audit openly admits this guy appears for exactly one sentence to sell the gun and then vanishes permanently into the parking garage of history. The creators laugh at themselves here, asking, is the missing nose some profound metaphor for the erasure of individual identity under late-stage capitalism? Nope. They admit they just thought it sounded vivid and moved on, leaving this incredibly bizarre detail forever unexplained. At this point in the audit, another AI perspective, Grok, chimes in with just the ultimate internet troll takedown. Grok mocks the entire structural arc of the story, pointing out that it reads exactly like revolutionary fan fiction. In this universe, a finance bro reading one evil memo is somehow enough to cause a chain reaction that accidentally starts a global great awakening. Grok notes that the authors effectively took the brutal reality of late-stage capitalism and turned it into a massive melodramatic group therapy session. Gemini also fires off this rapid-fire roast of the book's incredibly overwrought prose. At one point, the character Thomas is actually described as a calculator made of meat, which Gemini jokes sounds exactly like a LinkedIn bio for a severely burned-out data analyst. And when Thomas dramatically tells Elias that the numbers are screaming, Gemini hilariously points out that, guys, if the numbers in your spreadsheet are screaming, that's not an existential crisis, it's just an Excel syntax error. Grok sums up this bizarre plot progression perfectly. Revolution as self-help. Because the massive demonic corporate system doesn't actually fall at the end of the book. Instead, the characters leak a document, go down to a psychic basement to face their trauma, and then decide to start a vegetable cooperative. The ultimate victory condition against a trillion-dollar opioid-pushing syndicate is apparently getting mildly inconvenienced by mutual aid networks while sipping bad coffee at a strike support meeting. And the absolute punchline to this whole redemption arc is the fate of Victoria Siebert. She starts the novel as this terrifying, hyper-competent corporate strategist who optimizes global human trafficking syndicates. But by the end, she achieves her existential redemption by quitting to become a home health aide. The AIs point out the pure absurdity of this transition. She literally goes from the absolute apex of global economic dominance to achieving true meaning through janitorial work for the human soul. So that brings us to the final, unbelievably dramatic sentence of the novel. After 300 pages of demonize, missing noses, and relentless existential dread, the book ends with a three-dot pause before the word unacceptable. The authors openly admit in the audit that they are furious with themselves over this. They wanted to condemn the book completely, but they admit that after all the overwritten madness, this dramatic pause actually works. It lands perfectly, and they absolutely hate that it's correct. So, taking a step back, why does any of this actually matter? Well, because underneath all the ruthless roasting and the cynical humor, the creators highlight that the novel was genuinely trying to grapple with something real. Systems really do dehumanize people, and we are often complicit. Just like Thomas, we are all holding our own version of that to-me briefcase, participating in a structure we know is flawed. The book, as completely absurd as it is, perfectly illustrates our modern struggle to articulate our resistance against massive structural power. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative meta-thought from the source text. If a human and two AIs deliberately build a literary machine of corporate suffering, only to immediately consume it and write an audit about how terrible it is, who is really the Ouroboros? The snake didn't just eat its tail. It used its tail as a pen to write a book report about eating itself. It really makes you wonder, in our modern world where we constantly build systems just to critique them, where exactly are the boundaries between the systems we create, the stories we tell about them, and our own complicity? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.